Chapter 7, Conclusion. Al-Khidr, the Lineage and Liminality of the Foreshadow. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming. There is a man who lives in the wilderness outside of town. Some say he is a magician, some call him a priest of nature, and others insist that he is an all-seeing seer, but his powers are ancient and mysterious. His hermetic existence is evident in his wild appearance. It is difficult to distinguish his unkempt body hair from the skins and furs he wears as garments. At times he seems to confuse future with the past, effect with cause, and so his enigmatic words hover between wisdom and madness. Even still, his life's mission stretches clearly before him at every moment. Someone or something is coming, though he knows not precisely where or when, and everything will change. A new era is beginning, though the world will not recognize it. But from his place in the shadows, this wild man anticipates the birth of a new light. Dissertation Overview. The goal of any comparative study, and especially an archetypal one, is to compare seemingly dissimilar motifs or figures from across cultures and time, and demonstrate that they are in some way connected after all, that they are products of a single phenomenon. Accordingly, this dissertation has argued for the existence of an archetypal presence that I call the foreshadow. With each progressive chapter, additional character studies were introduced to highlight particular aspects of the foreshadow until a sort of archetypal biography could emerge. Chapter 2 introduced Jung's general model of the psyche, focusing most heavily on Jung's own description of central archetypal structures, including the ego, persona, the self, and of course, the shadow. Beloved literary shadow figures like Goethe's Mephistopheles, Stevenson's Mr. Hyde, and Hesse's Steppenwolf were brought up in order to build familiarity with the symbols, motifs, and larger themes which naturally manifest surrounding the shadow archetype. Chapter 3 progressed further into post-Jungian territory to explore how later thinkers applied and evolved Jung's ideas. Prominent among these thinkers was Edinger because of his vital addition of the ego-self axis, along which I theorized a shadow-foreshadow axis. The chapter then illustrated these dual axes with a comparative biblical character study. The lethal relationship of Cain and Abel gave way to a combative yet eventually reconciliatory relationship between Jacob and Esau, and finally to the instant love and cooperation between Jesus and John the Baptist, demonstrating the full spectrum of individuation from the primordial ego shadow to the ideal self-foreshadow dynamic. At the same time, John the Baptist was introduced as the study's first practical example of how the foreshadow archetype presents itself within a narrative and distinguishes itself from more traditional shadow figures. Chapter 4 broadened in the potential application of the foreshadow concept by analyzing a series of Old Testament figures whose respective roles as foreshadow paved the way for the archetype of the self in an object symbol. In Chapter 5, Merlin the magician served as a prime example of the foreshadow archetype in a secular setting. Like the Old Testament prophets, Merlin served as forerunner to a powerful object symbol of the self, the Holy Grail, offering for feudal Europe a higher principle to strive for and pulling the collective gaze away from old Rome toward a new worldview. Chapter 6 took the study for the first time out of a Western paradigm to explore the ancient traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. By beginning with the superhuman and mythologically vibrant foreshadow figure of Hanuman, and ending with Siddhartha on his introverted hero journey to awaken the Buddha within, Chapter 6 again broadened the potential application of the foreshadow concept. The foreshadow is not simply a rigid collection of particular motifs. He is a living protean presence who appears with both commonalities and differences in the West and in the East, in religious and secular settings, as a superhuman being with extraordinary abilities, or as a vitally important stage of internal transformation. For the most part, evidence for the foreshadow archetype has been anecdotal. Hanuman, Merlin, and Samson are all born hairy. John the Baptist, Hanuman, and Hessa's Siddhartha are sons of holy men. Nearly all figures studied are products of elderly or otherwise barren couples. There have also been a number of more direct connections between these figures, adding credence to my theory by leaning on the more authoritative voices of experts and great thinkers. To this end, Bulgakov's paradoxical claim that, quote, John is Elijah, though Elijah is not John, becomes all the more intriguing when set beside Matthew's similar claim. Elijah becomes the archangel, Sandalphon the way-shower. Perhaps we are not stretching this idea too far if we suggest that the next reappearance of this mighty being is Merlin himself. But in Alone with the Alone, foundational Islamist Henry Corbin connects Elijah to another figure, Al-Khidr, the mysterious green man of the Islamic world. Quote, Khidr and Elijah are sometimes associated to form a pair and sometimes identified as one. The three mythobiographies, three unaffiliated experts draw direct lines of association between their subjects, John the Baptist, Merlin the magician, Al-Khidr, and Elijah the prophet. Equally direct associations could certainly bring other figures into this strange, mysterious lineage of the foreshadow, as Philip Gardiner demonstrates in Secrets of the Serpent. Quote, El-Khidr is also equated with St. George, the wandering Jew, Elijah, Moses, the one with the serpent staff, Melchizedek, the longest living person in the Bible, Dionysus, said to be the Greek green man before he took on the role of wine and ecstasy, and the Druze say that El-Khidr is John the Baptist, which is interesting when we consider that Lady Raglan and Sir James Fraser pointed out that the human representations of the year, king, and queen, green man and woman, were usually decapitated and then hung on a tree, as John is decapitated and Jesus is hung on a tree. This, of course, makes John and Jesus two aspects of the same thing. End quote. But at a certain point, bringing in additional connections or authoritative voices into a comparative study becomes gratuitous. If the many archetypal lines in the sky still have not formed a recognizable constellation, connecting two more stars will not help. It is at these moments that we comparativists must veer away from the minutiae and, as Matthews does in Merlin, Shaman, Prophet, and Magician, highlight instead the living essence of the archetype. Quote, Despite their many differences, these figures share certain important aspects. They are all mysterious, shadowy beings who appear at a time of crucial import to a particular group of people and who have neither an orthodox beginning nor end to their lives. Finally, each withdraws or disappears, leaving conflicting accounts of their actual existence, function, or allegiance. As Matthews puts it, Al-Khidr has, quote, many differences, end quote, from the previous foreshadow figures we have studied. But despite these differences, he must certainly be listed as one more mysterious shadowy being who can offer a few insights of his own into our understanding of the foreshadow archetype. Among all of the foreshadow figures explored thus far, Al-Khidr is particular in two regards. First, he does not serve as a foreshadow figure himself so much as he keeps and transmits the knowledge and skills necessary to do so. He is the protector of a mysterious lineage and an embodiment of the foreshadow's eternal mission. Second, Al-Khidr's perpetual existence in the betwixt and between further highlights the foreshadow's unique liminality. Al-Khidr meets his disciples where the two seas meet, and seems always to be found, like the foreshadow archetype itself, somewhere between future and past, between nature and civilization, between the devil and God, God and man and beast. Al-Khidr and the lineage of the foreshadow. Some legends say every saint is visited by Al-Khidr, while other legends say everyone will be visited by Al-Khidr at least once in his or her lifetime. Hugh Tallet Hallman, Where the Two Seas Meet. Having already explored madmen and magicians, monkey gods, doppelgangers, demon kings, and more, it might be surprising to learn that this dissertation will conclude with a figure whose enigmatic presence arguably surpasses them all. Al-Khidr, generally translated as the Green Man or Verdant One, is an Islamic folk figure who both appears literally and figuratively at key moments throughout the long history of the faith. But instead of playing a narrative role as the foreshadow, Al-Khidr seems to manifest with the singular goal to meet in secret with an emerging religious figure. He serves as a de facto mentor, bestowing upon his disciples a mystical form of gnosis that is particular to the foreshadow archetype. Khidr therefore answers a line of inquiry that has previously been left unanswered in this dissertation. Who taught Merlin how to gaze into the future? Where did John the Baptist learn his ascetic ways? Asked another way, who teaches the foreshadow how to be the foreshadow? One answer from this tradition of Islamic mysticism would be that these figures all receive a secret visit and joined the ranks as one of the so-called disciples of Khidr. In a sense, Al-Khidr is not a foreshadow figure at all. Rather, he serves as teacher, mentor, and guide to the future foreshadow figures. He is therefore the closest thing to what Jungians call the archetype per se, that protean source within the collective unconscious from which the archetypal image draws its essence. Indeed, for Jung, the archetypes themselves are largely indefinable. It is only when an archetype manifests in symbolic form as an image, figure, or object that we can hope to interpret or learn from them. Yet, Al-Khidr somehow embodies the foreshadow per se, a paradoxical dual role, which Corbin touches on, saying that, quote, phenomenologically speaking, the real presence of Khidr is experienced simultaneously as that of a person and as that of an archetype. In other words, as a person archetype. End quote. The foreshadow and the motif of the three baffling acts. Faithful John is like Khidr. He is a representative of the divine principle in the unconscious, which has great knowledge, and therefore he is misunderstood by the new principle of consciousness represented by the prince. Marie-Louise von Franz, Shadow and Evil and Fairy Tale, page 86. To better understand Al-Khidr's unique role as the holder and transmitter of the foreshadow's archetypal powers, we will now analyze in some detail the story that is perhaps most vital to Khidr's legend, his meeting with Moses in the Quran. At the same time, this will introduce a very peculiar motif that can be found with intriguing consistency in the folk narratives of the Islamic and Jewish folk traditions, in Arthurian legend, in Grimm's fairy tales, and beyond. In this motif, a hero is led by a mysterious companion who, in return for his guidance, asks that his methods not be questioned. Quote, if you follow me, do not ask me about anything until I myself make mention of it to you. End quote. When this mysterious friend commits two baffling acts, the main character is hardly able to hold his tongue, but as folk tales tend to go, the third bewildering event is too much to handle. This particular motif, what we might call the three baffling acts, brings together a high number of previously discussed foreshadow figures, including Al-Khidr, Moses, Merlin, Elijah, Hanuman, as well as a folk figure by the name of Faithful or Trusty John. Al-Khidr and Moses. Al-Khidr said, if you follow me, do not ask me about anything until I myself make mention of it to you. Clear Quran. Though Corbin's analysis of the character is astute, it is important to note that Al-Khidr is not actually the main focus of Alone with the Alone. For a more complete character study, we therefore lean heavily on Hugh Talat Hallman's Where the Two Seas Meet, the Quranic story of Al-Khidr and Moses in Sufi commentaries, as a model of spiritual guidance. As the title suggests, Hallman uses the short narrative of Moses' meeting with Khidr as his central metaphor and the underpinning for his book, essentially casting them as an image of the ideal teacher-student relationship. In the tale, Moses makes his way to the liminal place where the two seas meet in order to seek out Al-Khidr as his teacher. Before accepting Moses as a pupil, Khidr makes one stipulation. If you follow me, do not ask me anything about anything until I myself make mention of it to you. Moses, perhaps too quickly, agrees to this requirement, and the two begin their educational journey together. Though accounts vary somewhat, the general framework for the narrative is consistent. Al-Khidr and Moses first walk to a river, itself a symbolically potent location for the Foreshadow archetype. Inexplicably, Khidr drills a hole in a number of fishing boats along the riverside. Before remembering his vow, Moses impulsively asks, "Did you hole it to drown its passengers? You have done something awful." The two continue on and soon encounter a child on the side of the road, whom Khidr suddenly kills. Again, Moses speaks out before being reprimanded for his lack of patience. Finally, after the townspeople refuse to offer the travelers hospitality, Al-Khidr chooses to repair the protective wall which surrounds the city. Entirely baffled, Moses breaks the terms of the agreement for a third and final time. As for the boat, it belonged to paupers working at sea. I wanted to damage it because there was a king coming for them, seizing every boat by force. As for the boy, his parents were believers, and we feared he would overwhelm them with oppression and disbelief. So we wanted their Lord to replace him with someone better in purity and closer to mercy. And as for the wall, it belonged to two orphan boys in the city. Beneath it was a treasure that belonged to them. Their father was a righteous man. Your Lord wanted them to reach their maturity and then extract their treasure as a mercy from your Lord. I did not do it of my own accord. This is the interpretation of what you were unable to endure. It is difficult to determine what it is particularly that Moses hopes to learn from Khidr. In all three of the great Abrahamic faiths, Moses is, after all, the paragon of wisdom. It is likewise unclear when this meeting takes place in Moses' larger narrative. From the Islamic perspective, the implication seems to be that it was only by means of this meeting with Khidr at the very beginning of his journey that Moses became the master of esoteric knowledge and compassion, who is deemed worthy to lead Yahweh's people and even speak with him face to face. In another iteration of the tale, Moses is replaced with a folk version of the ancient Greek warrior king Alexander the Great. And instead of instructing him in esoteric mysteries of esoteric knowledge, the immortal Al-Khidr leads Alexander on a quest for the waters of eternal life. This, of course, connects the motif to the world of Arthurian legend, making Alexander into a de facto Grail Knight and thereby casting Al-Khidr as a stand-in for Merlin the magician. Merlin and the King. Quote, once again, in exchange for his freedom, Merlin consents to reply. The beggar did not know that he was sitting on top of a treasure, nor the young man that he would die a few moments later. Merlin's assertions are examined and proven accurate. He leaves for the forest. With only a surface-level reading, the story of Moses and Al-Khidr would seem to be no more than a first meeting between apprentice and master. But Hallman sees it as a deeply significant archetypal event, calling it the, quote, perennial search for the one who lives beyond death, yet also touches life with meaning. Once again, this particular language connects the meeting and the motif of the three baffling acts at its core to Arthurian Grail mythos. In a dissertation about the Foreshadow archetype, it would not be enough to simply track down comparable examples of a particular motif. The motif of the three baffling acts is therefore only relevant to the degree that it relates specifically to established foreshadow figures and further clarifies the constellation of symbols that surrounds the archetype. It is in Geoffrey Monmouth's 12th century text, Vita Merlini, that we see this sort of syncretism in both the detail and larger picture. Geoffrey's early depiction of Merlin is as a madman whose powers as a clairvoyant are still being tested. Indeed, it is almost as though the figure's centuries-long evolution from primordial madman to legendary magician is illustrated there in the microcosm of the character's personal arc. Where Al-Khidr bewilders Moses by actually killing a child, Merlin's first baffling act is to predict the death of a child in three different ways. In an effort to discredit his powers, the king's jealous advisors disguise the same child 3 times and ask Merlin to predict his death. Because of Merlin's 3 separate prophecies, the king's advisors immediately try to oust him as a charlatan until the predictions all come true at once. Quote, "Now the child whose death Merlin had predicted in 3 different fashions falls on a rock in a chasm while chasing a stag, drowns in the river, and is caught and held by a tree branch." Soon after this, the second and third baffling acts occur in quick succession. Upon seeing a man buying a pair of shoes and extra leather for mending them in the future, Merlin begins to laugh uncontrollably. It is not until later that the reader learns why Merlin laughed. This young man is preparing for a future that will not happen because he is destined to die that very hour. Though we may say that this scene lines up most closely with Al-Khidr's sabotaging of the river boats, the similarities are minor at best, but the synchronicities of the final event put any thought of coincidence to rest. Merlin again begins to laugh when he sees a poor man begging in front of a palace wall. Instead of repairing a wall to keep the treasure beneath it hidden, Merlin only laughs at the beggar. Didn't know that he was sitting on top of a treasure. One element that seems to be missing from Merlin's tale is the vow to ask no questions. In place of this, however, it is Merlin himself who explains why his words and deeds will always be baffling. Quote, "They will ask me many questions that I would not care to answer. From now on, moreover, I shall speak in public only in veiled terms, so that people will understand what I foretell only when they see it happen." But the most notable difference between these two tales is that, for whatever reason, Al-Khidr's role in the narrative is more active than Merlin's. Khidr kills a child, where Merlin simply predicts his death. Khidr damages the boats, while Merlin mocks the futility of mending shoes. Khidr repairs a wall to obstruct the treasure, but Merlin merely laughs at the irony of a poor man begging just feet above a buried treasure. Elijah and Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. All the rabbi asked for was that he might be permitted to accompany Elijah on his wanderings throughout the world. Elijah was prepared to gratify this wish. He only imposed one condition, that, however odd the rabbi might think Elijah's actions, he was not to ask any explanation of them. Louis Ginsberg, Legends of the Bible. There are not many studies that draw a direct line of association, as this dissertation does, between Merlin the magician and Al-Khidr. But as we saw in Chapter 5, Merlin's direct connection to Elijah the prophet is a well-established fact, and Al-Khidr's connection to Elijah is equally established, so much so that the two figures are often referred to by the fused name of Khidr Elijah. In this way, Elijah can serve as a linchpin between the two figures. But the field of comparative mythology has long been criticized for this line of thinking. When entered into too lightly this sort of transitive property of archetypes. Quote, if figure A is like figure B and figure B like figure C, then A is like C, tends to produce suspect associations described in ill-defined universalist terms. And this is why the motif of the three baffling acts is so vital to this conclusion. After 6 chapters that in large part compare two figures at a time, the conclusion looks to a single motif that appears with some regularity in the traditions of almost all of our character studies. For access to the extensive tradition of Jewish folklore, we must once again go to Ginsberg's Legend of the Bible. In one tale, a young rabbi asks for a chance to follow Elijah the prophet, and in order to learn from him. Elijah has one caveat, which is by now quite familiar. Quote, however odd the rabbi might think Elijah's actions, he was not to ask any explanation of them. Agreeing too quickly to these terms, as Moses did, the rabbi begins his journey with Elijah through the wilderness. The two travelers first meet in an elderly couple who, despite their great poverty, welcome Elijah and the young rabbi into their home. As the guests pack their belongings, the following morning, Rabbi Joshua overhears Elijah praying for the couple's only cow to die. The second night could not have been more different from the first. In place of a poor but generous couple, Elijah and the rabbi stay with a wealthy man who refuses to offer even basic hospitality. In addition to his greed, this man is also distracted with his plans to repair a wall on his property. But even after their uncomfortable stay, Elijah prays to the Lord, who miraculously repairs the wall. The rabbi is, of course, barely able to hold his tongue at this perceived injustice. There are actually 4 baffling acts rather than the usual 3 in the story of Elijah and the rabbi Joshua. But in a sense, the final 2 acts can be seen as part of the same event. Elijah and the rabbi go to 2 synagogues in a row. At the first, they are treated rather poorly, and Elijah prays to have everyone in the congregation be honored at the level of a spiritual leader. In the second synagogue, the travelers are kindly and attended to in every regard, and yet Elijah prays that one be elevated as a spiritual leader. As expected, the young rabbi finally loses all patience and demands an explanation for Elijah's behavior. The poor man's cow was killed because I knew that on the same day the death of his wife had been ordained in heaven, and I prayed to God to accept the loss of the poor man's cow as a substitute. As for the rich man, there was a treasure hidden beneath a dilapidated wall. I wished for the inhospitable people assembled in the synagogue might have many heads, because a place of numerous leaders is bound to be ruined by reason of multiplicity of counsel and disputes. To the inhabitants of our last sojourning place, on the other hand, I wished a single head, for with one to guide a town, success will attend all its undertakings. More than either the Islamic tale of Al-Khidr and Moses or the Arthurian tale of Merlin and the king, the Jewish story of Elijah and the rabbi Joshua is itself a teaching tool. As such, Elijah continues on to explain not only his actions but also the larger lesson of the tale. Quote, now then, that is thou seest an evildoer prosper, it is not always unto his advantage, and if a righteous man suffers need and distress, think not God is unjust. Hanuman and Lord Rama. As afternoon shadows lengthen, crowds gather on the riverbank, anticipating the curious showdown between the Lord and his greatest devotee. Philip Ludendorff, The Hanuman's Tale, The Messengers of a Divine Monkey. Something close to this 3 baffling acts motif appears in a story from the Hanumaya, or the folk tales of Hanuman, with a few notable differences. Long after the events of the Ramayana, sometime during The long golden age of Lord Rama, a minor king of Kashi, is excitedly engaged in a hunt. But as he passes by a great stage, the king of Kashi is too distracted to offer proper respects, and all attempts to apologize for the insult are rebuffed. The sage goes straight to Lord Rama's court and demands the king's head at his feet. Hearing only the sage's side of the story, Rama's brow darkens. He removes 3 arrows from his quiver and vows that he will take the life of the king of Kashi before the sun sets. Rama's 3 arrows were introduced as tripling theme, which, though certainly not unique within the folk tales of the world, will to some degree take the place of the 3 baffling acts. Word spreads across the land of Rama's hasty vow, and the king of Kashi flees for his life. In some versions, the slighted sage instantly regrets his overblown response and counsels the king of Kashi in a way that he might escape Rama's wrath. He sends the terrified king to Anjana, Hanuman's mother, and instructs him to make her promise 3 times to help before offering the full detail. As luck would have it, Hanuman arrives at that very moment from Rama's court to visit his mother. In typical folk fashion, Anjana likewise makes her son promise 3 times to assist her, and Hanuman dutifully agrees. It is easy to become distracted with this clear tripling theme, 3 arrows, Anjana's 3 promises, Hanuman's 3 promises, and miss the deeper theme that is developing here. In an honor-based faith like ancient Hinduism, one of the most important dharmas is to keep your promise, no matter the cost. But how can we know for certain when keeping a promise is truly a matter of devotion to the dharma, and when it is only a prideful devotion to the ego? Like Al-Khidr, Merlin, and Elijah, Hanuman takes advantage of the ego's hasty nature by traveling straight to his beloved Lord Rama and exacting a promise of his own. Quote, "My Lord, please give me your word that I will always be able to protect those who are chanting your name." End quote. Rama is beyond delighted to offer this boon to Hanuman. In his egoless devotion, Hanuman rarely asks for anything for himself. Now the stage is set. Hanuman orders the king of Kashi to submerge himself up to the waist in a river and chant Rama's name in humble prayer. With 3 arrows in hand, Rama arrives on the scene. It is this moment that the Hindu equivalent of the 3 baffling acts begin. Like Al-Khidr's wanton vandalism of the boats, Merlin's paradoxical prophecies, or Elijah's killing of the poor man's cow, Rama is shocked to see his most devoted servant, Hanuman, standing at the riverside, club in hand, directly between him and his sworn victim. But the inflated ego never waits for an explanation. Lord Rama looses his first arrow. Shockingly, the arrow stops just before striking the king of Kashi, turns around, and speaks directly to Rama. Quote, "My lord, I can't kill someone who is chanting your name while Hanuman is around." Behaving far more like a tyrannical ego than a symbol of the self, Rama now swears, quote, that he will kill both the king and Hanuman, and fires his second arrow to the same effect. Finally, Rama uses his most powerful mantras to imbue his 3rd arrow with magic that could certainly break the king's protective chant. Seeing this, Hanuman unhesitantly directs Rama to shoot the arrow into his heart instead. Quote, "The arrow flew unerringly, split Hanuman's breast, and disappeared into his heart. To everyone's amazement, within his throbbing heart they saw Rama and Sita enshrined." The Foreshadow's egoless sacrifice finally dispels the tension of the scene. The king of Kashi, the great sage, Hanuman's mother, and even Lord Rama himself all admit that they acted in haste and that no one involved actually wanted this fatal outcome. Remembering the exact words of his original demand to have the king's, quote, head at his feet, the sage looks down to see the king of Kashi weeping at his feet and considers the matter closed. At first glance, it would seem that Hanuman is as guilty as any of the other characters in the tale. He too makes a promise in haste. Why then does he not share any of the blame? There are two central differences that distinguish the Foreshadow's role here. First, Hanuman defends the king of Kashi because he has heard both sides of the dispute and therefore sees the big picture. Second, Hanuman is the only figure in the story whose acts defend the dharma of others and not merely his own. By protecting the king of Kashi, Hanuman fulfills the triple promise that his mother made and thereby protects her honor. But more importantly, Hanuman only confronts Rama in order to help him make the right choice. As a king, Rama must place the dharma of justice, which he owes to his subjects, over his own personal honor. As a symbol of the self, Rama must uphold his promise to protect those who chant his name in devotion. Faithful John and the Young King. Faithful John is like Khidr. He is a representative of the divine principle in the unconscious which has great knowledge, and therefore he is misunderstood by the new principle of consciousness represented by the prince. Marie Louise von Franz, Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. As we have seen throughout this dissertation, one of the great wonders of the archetypes of the collective unconscious is their ability to manifest, quote, in ever-recurring motifs, in ever-new variations like music. After all, what interest would there be in a study that brought together examples of the three baffling acts if the stories were exactly the same? Instead, each instance proves to be so profoundly unique that one could likely pick any single connection and reasonably argue it away to nothing. But this is the power of archetypes and the constellations of images that manifest around them. Remove any single line and a recognizable image remains. The German folktale of Faithful John, a lesser-known Grimm's fairy tale, fits nicely into this archetypal constellation. As we will see, the storyline is entirely its own, and yet there is just something familiar about Faithful John himself. Like Hanuman, Samuel, and later iterations of Merlin, Faithful John is the best beloved servant of the king who served the king faithfully all his life. As the old king lies in his deathbed, his final request is that Faithful John protect his young son and help to mold him into the next great king. To this end, the young prince is to be given access to all of the hidden treasures of his inherited castle. But the old king makes Faithful John promise never to allow him into the last chamber down the hallway, in which lies a portrait of the princess of the Golden Palace that would bewitch the young prince. Faithful John unhesitantly agrees to his master's dying wish, saying, quote, I will never forsake him and will serve him faithfully even though it should cost my life. By foreshadowing his own death, Faithful John demonstrates some level of clairvoyance, and his role as a foreshadow figure begins to emerge. The old king dies, and, as folktales go, the new king quickly becomes obsessed with the one room he cannot enter. Eventually, Faithful John sees no alternative but to unlock the door. As his father had warned, the young king sees the portrait, falls desperately in love with the princess of the Golden Palace. The next phase of the story is much like the great Indian narrative studied in Chapter 6. Just as Siddhartha grows tired of his sheltered life in the palace, the young king loses all desire to eat or sleep. Just as Hanuman is sent ahead to search for Sita and bring back word to Rama, Faithful John now searches far and wide for the princess of the Golden Palace. In fact, the similarities to the Ramayana run far deeper than this. When Faithful John finally locates the Golden Palace, it is far across the seas like Ravana's golden city of Lanka. And when the young king finally makes it to the far shore, Faithful John tells him to stay in the ship while he, like Hanuman bringing the golden ring to Sita, goes ahead with golden trinkets to lure the princess back to the ship. It isn't until Faithful John, the young king, and his at first reluctant bride are sailing home that the motif of the three baffling acts begins to unfold. Quote, it happened, however, as they were still journeying on the open sea, that Faithful John, as he sat in the fore part of the ship and made music, caught sight of three ravens in the air flying overhead. Then he stopped playing and listened to what they said to one another, for he understood them quite well. End quote. Though there is no explanation offered in the story, there is not the first example. This is not the first example of the foreshadow archetype speaking the language of animals. But more specifically, we have also seen that the raven, with its dark feathers, its role as a messenger, its mythic gift of foresight, and its usual dwelling place in the forest, is at times directly associated with the foreshadow archetype. Assuming Faithful John to be a normal man, the three ravens openly prophesy about three separate events that are destined to cut the young couple's joy short. A red horse will buck the king off its back and kill him. A groom's wedding shirt will turn out to be poison, and the young bride will swoon during the wedding dance. Though each of these disasters can be avoided, so doing would come at a great cost. Whoever is responsible for denying destiny its prize will be turned to stone. Faithful John knows that the king will not believe his warnings, and so he decides to take matters into his own hands, whatever the personal cost. Just as Elijah kills the elderly couple's only cow, Faithful John shocks the king and his jealous advisers by jumping on the beautiful horse and shooting it through the head. Rightly bewildered, the king nevertheless trusts in his faithful John. Next, the apparent madman charges into the royal bedroom and, with metal gloves, throws a gorgeous wedding shirt into the fire. But the king trusts him still, saying, quote, "Who knows but that there may be good reason for it? Let him be, as he is my faithful John." But Faithful John's third and final baffling act is simply too much for the king to bear. In the middle of a wedding dance, the young bride begins to swoon. Before the king can reach her, Faithful John picks her up and rushes her into the royal bedchamber. By the time the king makes his way in, the queen is reviving, and there, crouching above her, is Faithful John, having drawn 3 drops of blood from her breast. For a moment, the young king transitions from potential symbol of the self to the all too familiar tyrannical ego. Like Moses and Pharaoh, Ahab with Elijah, Herod with John the Baptist, Ravana with Hanuman, or Vortigern with Merlin, the young king calls for the head of faithful John the Foreshadow. As with every instance of the 3 baffling acts, the foreshadow figure is only able to explain his odd behavior when it is already too late. The king is instantly sorry for his lack of faith and revokes the death sentence just as faithful John turns to stone. As one might expect from a fairy tale, there is eventually a happy resolution. The king and queen place the statue of faithful John in their bedroom as a reminder of their eternal debt to him. Eventually, the queen becomes pregnant, just like Sita, with twin boys. But one day, as the king and queen watch the boys play, the statue of faithful John speaks. "If thou wilt cut off the head of thy 2 children with thy own hand, and bespear me with their blood, I shall receive life again." Knowing that they owe everything to faithful John, the crestfallen couple do as they are told, and as soon as faithful John is restored to life, he rewards the king and queen for their faithfulness and brings their children back to life as well. Interpreting the baffling acts of the foreshadow. Complete trust in faithful John is required from the prince, just as the same blind faith that Khidr asked for of Moses, with no questions as to the why and wherefore, or dotting of the I. Faithful John, who suspects that the young king will not accept the situation and trust him in regard to his actions, all the same decides to save the king. Marie Louise von Franz, Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tale 94. Throughout this dissertation, we have viewed the foreshadow archetype as a sort of messenger figure sent ahead from the collective unconscious to prepare the way for a new symbol of the self and a new age. In her depth psychological interpretation of Faithful John, in which she directly relates the figure to Al-Khidr, von Franz says much the same thing. Quote, Faithful John is like Khidr. He is a representative of the divine principle in the unconscious which has great knowledge, and therefore he is misunderstood by the new principle of consciousness represented by the prince. As always, the king is a symbol of the ego consciousness at some stage or another along its path of individuation. At times the king is tyrannical, and at times he is righteous, but through it all, the crown, throne, and scepter remain as symbols of the self, the seldom attained but ever-present potential for enlightenment. Faithful John is not, in the end, faithful to the old and dying king, nor to the young and immature one. As Merlin puts it, a living king is rarely more than, quote, a regent for him who went before and him who comes after, the past and future king. Lord Rama himself barely hesitates before firing an arrow into the heart of his utterly devoted servant, Hanuman. Despite what the king himself believes, Faithful John actually lives in service to the idea of a king, the divine king made manifest. And the true purpose of the three baffling acts motif is to make this distinction abundantly clear to the ego. After all, the Foreshadow's actions are only baffling from an ego perspective of power and control, and the inflated ego must be dissuaded of these notions if there is ever to be hope for individuation. Von Franz explains that this is also the reason for Al-Khidr's strict no questions asked policy. Quote, Complete trust in Faithful John is required from the prince, just the same blind faith that Khidr asked of Moses, with no questions as to the why and wherefore or dotting of the I. Faithful John, who suspects that the young king will not accept the situation and trust him in regard to his actions, all the same decides to save the king. Perhaps this in part explains why the motif of the three baffling acts does not recognizably appear in association with the foreshadow figures of Siddhartha or John the Baptist. As arguably the greatest paragons of inner transcendence and self-reflection in history, neither the Buddha nor Jesus ever displays the signs of an inflated ego which needs to be humbled by the forces of the collective unconscious. This is one lesson that the foreshadow need not teach. The Foreshadow and the Disciples of Khidr. We here consider Al-Khidr essentially as the invisible spiritual master reserved for those who are called to a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine world, that is, a bond seeking no historical justification in a historical succession of sheiks, for those who owe their investiture to no authority. Henry Corbin, Alone with the Alone. The high level of synchronicity between the different instances of the three baffling acts motif covered above might easily distract from the central thesis of this section, that Al-Khidr is largely unique in that he is not a foreshadow figure himself, but rather the holder and transmitter of the powers and knowledge necessary to be a foreshadow figure. This distinction is most clearly seen when we compare the intended recipients of this lesson. Merlin, Hanuman, and Faithful John all commit their baffling acts for the sake of protecting and teaching their king. In this sense, they are performing their usual role as foreshadow figure to, quote, walk before the anointed and, quote, make ready the way for the archetype of the self. But what little we know of Elijah's pupil, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, shows him to be a spiritual leader, not a king, a potential symbol of the self, or even an ego hero. Noting again that Khidr and Elijah are sometimes associated to form a pair and sometimes identified as one, we might certainly say the same of Khidr's pupil, Moses. Chapter 4 demonstrated that although Moses has a few traits associated with the hero archetype, he primarily plays the role of the foreshadow, preparing Israel for the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant as the axis mundi of its newfound formed culture. This is why we say that Khidr Elijah is not actually a foreshadow figure. Instead of preparing the world for its next symbol of the self, he appears to Moses and other potential foreshadow figures, the so-called disciples of Khidr, in order to train them in the secret for the mysterious role they must soon perform. This is not meant in a purely literal sense. After all, what difference does it make whether the source of the foreshadow's powers is a prophetic dream, a magical book of spells, an Old Testament prophet, or an obscure Islamic folk figure? Rather, Khidr is the very embodiment of those archetypal powers and a personification of the process of transmission. When Corbin speaks to this complex relationship between Al-Khidr and his disciples, we might say that he is also describing the mysterious lineage of the foreshadow archetype. Quote, what we have learned about the disciples of Khidr, the transhistorical meaning of the affiliation which unites them vertically with the invisible celestial assembly, implies the idea of a tradition whose line is vertical, longitudinal, from heaven to earth, a tradition whose moments are independent of the causality of continuous physical time, but relate to the recurrence of the creative act, that is, the theophany. End quote. Corbin's particular vocabulary here is as astute as it is complex. The foreshadow's line of succession is indeed vertical, passed from a single master to a single disciple, like Elijah's mantle taken up by Elisha. The foreshadow's lineage is transhistorical. John the Baptist is born with the, quote, spirit and power of Elijah, some 800 years after the prophet's presumed death. And finally, the powers of the foreshadow are a tradition, not a bloodline or an inheritance. This final point deserves further discussion. One of the most consistent particularities of the hero archetype is his or her direct, unbroken connection to a royal divine bloodline. Indeed, regardless of the ego hero's position along Edinger's ego-self axis, proof of this patrilineal ancestral line is often the great revelation at the narrative's climax. This, of course, helps to explain why the archetypal hero, the archetypal king, and even the archetypal ego are so often conflated in folk tales and myths the world over. But even Jesus and the Buddha, era-defining icons who subverted all expectations by being spiritual rather than political leaders, were painstakingly connected to a royal bloodline of kings. Quote, Joseph went up to the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem, the town of David in Judea, because he belonged to the house and lineage of David. End quote. The foreshadow archetype also relies on what Corbin calls a vertical line of succession, and yet there is something far more shadowy about this lineage. With no connection to royalty and set apart from historical time, the archetypal powers of the foreshadow are passed on like a torch, a mantle, or a mystical craft from master to disciple, awaiting the prophesied arrival of the self. Al-Khidr and the liminality of the foreshadow. Al-Khidr, the Green Man, is a youthful figure who never lived yet embodied life. He will never die, yet he dies every day in multiple ways for each of us who see beyond the screen of death and espy the barzakh, which is his perpetual home. Hugh Talat Hallman, where the two seas meet. This concluding chapter argues that among all of the foreshadow figures explored in this dissertation, Al-Khidr is particular in two regards. As the last section demonstrated, Khidr is not a foreshadow figure himself so much as a keeper and transmitter of the foreshadow's archetypal powers. But Khidr is also unique in the way that he exemplifies what Victor Turner would call the liminality of the foreshadow. Al-Khidr lives out his enigmatic existence in the betwixt and between state, hovering somewhere between future and past, nature and civilization, the devil and God, God and man, man and beast. The space between, the foreshadow in the barzakh. Al-Khidr encounters Moses at the point beyond territory, the time beyond calendar, the barzakh, or in-between space of human divine and terrestrial/celestial. Hugh Talat Hallman, where the two seas meet. It is no coincidence that the Quranic story of Al-Khidr's meeting with Moses does not truly fit in to Moses' larger narrative and timeline. When does this story take place? Like a traditional fairy tale, Moses goes in search of Al-Khidr once upon a time. The Quranic passage itself seems to start out of nowhere at almost the exact midpoint of a surah. Quote, "And these towns, we destroyed them when they committed injustices, and we set for their destruction an appointed time. Recall when Moses said to his servant, I will not give up until I reach the junction of the two rivers, even if it takes me years." End quote. Where does the story take place? As Hallman's title suggests, the encounter occurs where the two seas meet, but no further context is offered to indicate which two seas it refers to. This is not some accidental lack of detail. The foreshadow is a liminal force that exists in what Corbin refers to as a, quote, transcendent, transhistorical dimension, end quote. The Islamic tradition calls Al-Khidr's hidden realm the barzakh, a Persian word that literally translates to barrier or boundary. Hallman's description of the barzakh is a perfect example of what Turner means by liminality. Quote, "A new exegetical interpretive window opens to the reader, explorer, seeker upon arriving at the threshold of the barzakh. It is a place in time and beyond time. It is where Al-Khidr and Moses meet in a state that is in this world yet beyond it. It is both and neither, neither nor at the same time. Some have suggested that what is conveyed in the following exchange is a conversation also out of time. Instead of taking place between a real Moses and Al-Khidr, it unfolds in an imaginal world linking this world and the next world yet apart from both." End quote. In Hahnemann's tale, Ludendorff further demonstrates the foreshadow's role in the betwixt and between, even using Turner's own terminology. Quote, "In India, Hahnemann has long been associated with liminal spaces that mark the boundary between human habitation and unsettled jungle, as well as with the mountains and vanishing forests, where his devotees occasionally encounter him. After the death of his lord Rama, Hanuman retreats to his Himalayan mountain home to begin his ascetic life as one of the seven immortal Chiranajiva. Like Al-Khidr in his barzakh, the monkey god meditates on the, quote, unending transformations of matter, birth and death, joy and sorrow, aspiration and frustration, union and separation, as he waits to be called forth in the next earthly age. As we saw in Chapter 5, Merlin the Magician also has his timeless liminal home, akin to Khidr's barzakh and Hanuman's mountain retreat. Some picture Merlin voluntarily escaping to his esplumior, or place of shedding, in the darkness of the woods. As Markel describes it, quote, "By taking refuge in the heart of the forest, Merlin withdraws completely. He separates himself from the society of his time and affirms his discovery of a new reality, a new alliance." As an aspect of the shadow archetype, the foreshadow can only survive the direct light of consciousness for so long before returning to its natural dwelling place in the wilderness of the collective unconscious. The more usual story, of course, tells of Merlin's beguiling by the enchantress Vivian. Quote, "Buried alive, I told you I should be, by love made little and by woman shorn, like Samson of my glory." But whether imprisoned in a crystal tomb or waiting to be recalled from his molting cage, Merlin nevertheless lives on in a kind of quasi-immortality that is unique to the foreshadow archetype. Like a molting bird or a hibernating bear, Merlin patiently waits through the long centuries until he is called again from the shadows. From Merlin's Esplumior to the Himalayan retreat of Hanuman, seemingly every foreshadow figure has some equivalent to Al-Khidr's barzakh, the timeless liminal home between life and death that is, quote, in this world and yet beyond it. Where is Moses' long-lost grave, high on a mountain overlooking the Holy Land that he was not allowed to enter? Where does Elijah reside during his 8, quote, centuries of stony sleep before slouching toward Bethlehem to be born again as John the Baptist? What barzakh holds John the Baptist now, his own head in his hands, as he continues his ministry in the world below, beyond the grave? End quote. The man between, the foreshadow as the liminal threshold. Hanuman has legs in both camps, Shiva and Vishnu. John bridges together the Old Testament and the New Testament with a foot in each camp. Hanuman subsequently kept a foot in both camps, or more appropriately, flew in the air between them. John stands at the boundary between the Old and New Testaments. If we were to stop here, having only addressed the liminality of the barzakh, the eternal meeting place, the wilderness retreat, we would not fully understand the liminality of the foreshadow. Indeed, it is not only the location that is, quote, both and neither nor at the same time, but the archetype as a whole. This is one final aspect of the disciples of Khidr that is so vital to understand. With Al-Khidr, the common idiom, quote, the student has become the master, is entirely literal. We will call this phenomenon archetypal assimilation. If a would-be disciple makes it all the way to the barzakh, quote, henceforth he is Khidr, he has attained the Khidr of his being. End quote. The only power that seems to be non-transferable is this power of archetypal assimilation itself. Said another way, when Merlin, Faithful John, or Hanuman offer the lesson of the 3 baffling acts, their pupil receives a valuable life lesson. When Al-Khidr offers the lesson of the 3 baffling acts, Moses becomes Al-Khidr. In this sense, we must imagine that each of the major characters in this dissertation received a call from Al-Khidr, made their inner pilgrimage to his barzakh, and left that place invested, quote, with the mantle of Khidr. As such, the foreshadow becomes as liminal as the barzakh, caught between 2 ages, fated to live the whole riddle of the human destiny. In chapter 4, we saw how the quasi-foreshadow figures of the Old Testament, Moses, Samson, Samuel, and Elijah, seem to naturally emerge from the liminal boundary between distinct phases of Israel's long history, but it was even more clearly seen in other chapters. In The Friend of the Bridegroom, for instance, Bulgakov describes John the Baptist's unique role as what some call the gatekeeper of the Gospels. Quote, John stands at the boundary between Old and New Testament, between Old and New Man. He is this very boundary. In or by him, this boundary is overcome in the human soul. But Burke uses precisely the same metaphor in John the Baptist, prophet and disciple. Quote, like the ancient colossus of roads that spans that harbor, John bridges together the Old Testament and the New Testament with a foot in each camp. Yes, his roots were in Second Temple Judaism, but his significance is in first century Christianity. He is himself the dividing point of the ages, the living boundary marker for the new dispensation, the proclaimer of the fullness of time. Though he certainly does not use the term foreshadow, we have already seen how well the underlying theme of Hesse's career interacts with the idea of the foreshadow. Steppenwolf is a man-wolf who feels, quote, caught between 2 ages in a negative sense. But in Siddhartha, we find a man who has finally embraced his own shadow and now celebrates his timeless role as the foreshadow of the Buddha. Quote, the river is everywhere at the same time, at the source and at the mouth, at the waterfall, at the ferry, at the current, in the ocean and in the mountains, everywhere at the present, and the present only exists for it, not the shadow of the past, nor the shadow of the future. I reviewed my life, and it was also a river, and Siddhartha the boy, Siddhartha the mature man, Siddhartha the old man were only separated by shadows. Hesse's recurring use of the shadow imagery in the above passage is telling. These are not the sinister shadows of nightmare, but the peaceful, pleasant shadows of life on the river. But the betwixt and between of the foreshadow is not limited to the liminality between, quote, two periods, two epochs, two times. Ludendorff calls Hahnemann the, quote, matchless mediator between the animal, human, demonic, and divine realms. He is even a mediator between the two great sects of Hinduism. Quote, if a divine monkey possibly emerging from the ancient popular worship of chthonic yakshas was originally positioned more on the dark side of the Vedic cosmos, he is also linked with the luminous realm of the celestial Vishnu. The literary and iconographic evidence suggests that Hanuman subsequently kept a foot in both camps, or more appropriately, flew in the air between them. Using once again the very same liminal metaphor as Bulgakov, Burke, and Glutendorf above, von Amalie likewise claims that Hanuman, quote, has legs in both camps, Shiva and Vishnu. His father is Shiva, and he is the greatest devotee of Vishnu in his avatar as Rama. Therefore, he became very popular with both Shivites and Vishnuvites. Set off from society in the timeless place of the hidden barzakh, esplumier, or mountain retreat, the foreshadow lives out his enigmatic existence, hovering between future and past at the place where the two seas meet. But when he is finally called forth from his place in the shadows, the foreshadow brings his liminality with him. Right in the axis mundi, where the tension of opposites is greatest, the foreshadow makes his home, bridging the gap between Shivites and Vishnuvites, pagans and Christians, ascetics and hedonists, country and city folk. Conclusions on the foreshadow, forging a home within Jungian psychology. Quote, Al-Khidr symbolizes not only the higher wisdom, but also a way of acting which is in accord with this wisdom and transcends reason. Anyone hearing such a mystery tale will recognize himself in the questioning Moses and the forgetful Joshua, and the tale shows him how the immortality bringing rebirth comes about. C.G. Jung, a typical set of symbols. There is one final way in which the Islamic green man can add to the study of the foreshadow archetype. Apart from highlighting the lineage and liminality of the foreshadow, Al-Khidr's enigmatic nature also helps to expose an underdeveloped recess of the Jungian model of the psyche. Jung actually wrote quite a lot about the figure of Al-Khidr, mostly in reference to the mystical science of alchemy. But it is, in my mind, a rare example of rigidity in Jung's thinking when he attempts to force the mercurial figure into his own system and ends up, quite unconvincingly, claiming Al-Khidr as a symbol of the self. Quote, living in the West, I would have to say Christ instead of the self. In the Near East, it would be Kadir. In the Far East, Atman or Tao or the Buddha. In the Far West, maybe a hare or Mondamin. And in Kabbalism, it would be Tefereth. To be clear, I am not arguing that there is anything underdeveloped about Jung's conception of the archetype of the self. Spread throughout his collected works is a consistent and coherent theory which systematically demonstrates how transcendent figures like the Buddha and Jesus are living symbols of the self who embody the, quote, totality of man, the sum total of his conscious and unconscious contents, end quote. Jung dedicated entire essays and chapters to these elegant symbols of the self, rightly placing Jesus and the Buddha as flagships of his theory. But in an attempt to cast his model of the psyche as truly universal, Jung seems to have occasionally made unfounded leaps, relying too heavily on his extraordinary intuition to, at all costs, find an example of each major archetype within whichever world culture he was currently preoccupied. Jung himself seems unconvinced by his Procrustean attempts to force Al-Khidr into a rigid system. Quote, Al-Khidr may well be a symbol of the self. Moses accepts him as a higher consciousness and looks up to him for instruction. Then follows those incomprehensible deeds which show how ego consciousness reacts to the superior guidance of the self through twists and turns of fate. Al-Khidr symbolizes not only the higher wisdom, but also a way of acting which is in accord with this wisdom and transcends reason. End quote. These incomprehensible deeds, what we have called the three baffling acts, are indeed examples of Khidr's superior guidance. But the Green Man is not actually a higher consciousness. He is a higher unconsciousness, whose wisdom, Jung admits, transcends reason. And because Jung did not have a term for this shadowy presence from the collective unconscious, he assumes it to be a symbol of the self. As an avid purveyor of Jungian thought, von Franz makes the same assumption for the figure of Faithful John, calling him a, quote, representative of the transcendent function of the self. But as she continues, it becomes clear that von Franz has her own misgivings about this archetypal diagnosis. Quote, if we take Faithful John as the principle or urge in the collective unconscious toward building up a new dominant of the collective unconscious, the maker of new kings, and therefore the representative of the transcendent function of the self, it seems strange that he should become petrified while fulfilling this task. The real issue here is the conflation of the transcendent function with the archetype of the self. By casting these two separate concepts, the transcendent function and the self, as interchangeable terms, von Franz conflates the modus operandi of ego individuation with its final goal. Edinger's theoretical concept of the ego-self axis has long served as a visual image for Jung's process of individuation. But as we saw in Chapter 3, Edinger's simple model offers no explanation for how or why the ego individuates in the first place. For this reason, our study added a shadow-foreshadow axis and suggested that shadow integration itself is the modus operandi of individuation. Said another way, our dual axis model is an illustration of a new axiom: shadow integration begets individuation. In a sense, Edinger's model lacks utility for the very same reason that Jung misdiagnoses Al-Khidr and von Franz misdiagnoses Faithful John as a symbol of the self. The Jungian model of the psyche is missing the vitally important archetypal presence that we have called the foreshadow. Jung's archetype of the self is the crown jewel of his system precisely because it represents the theoretical ideal of what the ego could be. Likewise, the foreshadow both is and is not a traditional shadow figure. As Edinger says of the ego, of the self, and the self, the terms shadow and foreshadow are simply, quote, different experiential levels of the same archetypal psychic process. The foreshadow is what the shadow always hopes, but is rarely given the opportunity to be: a dark and wild messenger from the collective unconscious, which trades in its sinister aesthetic to join and support the individuating ego in its apotheosis as the archetype of the self. The foreshadow lives in the wilderness outside of town. Though he is a priest, a prophet, a sorcerer, a herald, and more, he is only seen as a madman in his own time. But what is his own time? The foreshadow, quote, belongs to those who have been caught between two ages, fated to live the whole riddle of human destiny. He dresses like a madman because civil pleasantries are irrelevant when the, quote, kingdom of heaven is at hand, end quote, and personal comfort is no great price to pay for self-knowledge. In short, the Foreshadow is anachronistic and mysterious precisely because his mission transcends time and culture. By separating himself from the society of his time, the Foreshadow affirms his discovery of a new reality. The Foreshadow is the before shadow, the forerunner, lawgiver, keeper of the grail, and maker of kings. He is the middle way, the priest of nature, the voice of one, and the ultimate devotee. The Foreshadow is the green man, the prophet of the highest, the sage of the Shakyas, and the witness of the light whose sudden emergence from the wilderness announces the dawn of a new era and foreshadows the imminent arrival of the self.